All right. So with a few technical things fixed, we're ready to go. And I'd like to greet you warm welcome to this last pre-June session for the People's Forum around Stockholm 50 that we're organizing. And today we will look at both good real solutions as well as dangerous distractions and false solutions. And we have a really amazing lineup of folks that will share their experiences and thoughts around these issues, both here in Stockholm at the ABF-huset, which is also the venue for the People's Forum that will take place just a week from now, 31st of May to 1st of June. 50 sessions of all kinds of issues with people from all over the world will gather here for some pretty amazing days. We're absolutely convinced and hope to see many of you here. And also then there will be some streaming of some of the sessions. So this is a great pleasure for me to have dear friends from various movements, organizations and backgrounds to join us today. And as you can see maybe here from the lineup, it is going to be a presentation first by Alex Rafalovic, who is the director of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. And he will tell you more about this very fascinating initiative that has taken a tremendous kind of momentum in the last 1.5 years and really speaks to a real solution. We'll have Dipti Bhatnagar from Friends of the Earth International, based in Mozambique, who will also share some perspectives on real solutions, the kinds of energy system that we really need to replace the fossil fuel system with, and also have been working a lot to fight false solutions and dangerous distractions in many different ways. And she'll be able to share some of those experiences as well and insights. We'll have Teresa here, Anderson from ActionAid International, who is also working on many issues, agriculture, land issues, climate justice, and many other things. And she'll talk specifically today about net zero as a dangerous distraction or a false solution. We have Åsa Larsson Blind from the Sami Council, far up from here in the north of Sweden, who will also speak to some very dangerous distractions, in particular sharing some of the experiences from last year's fight against geoengineering experiments that were planned for the area around Kiruna, where she is based. And lastly, we have Cecilia Orsila Holm, who is wearing so many hats. She is involved in so many struggles here in Sweden, fighting fossil fuel refineries on the West Coast, protecting forests, being part of the treaty support work with Friends of the Earth, involved in People for Future as a grassroots kind of mobilizing movement, and many other things. So she'll share some of the work she's been doing on both the real side and the dangerous side. So that's what we're offered today. And my name is Niklas Hellström. I have my own platform called What Next, and have also been working quite a lot with the Fossil Fuel Treaty this last, again, 1.5 years, and particularly on the third pillar that Alex will share more about on just transition. So by that, I think we're ready to go. And I'll ask Alex to take the floor and share and tell about this exciting initiative that he's part of driving ahead with so many people and organizations and movements around the world. So please, Alex, the floor is yours. Just make sure you get to appear on the screen.
There we go.
There we go.
Thank you very much, Nicholas.
And Alex, we can't hear you right now. Is that because you're mute, or is it something here?
I'm not muted. I'm speaking.
Okay, here we're getting it back, the sound, yes. Yes.
Right.
Very good. And Rodrigo, we need to get his PowerPoint also. Here we go. Are you?
Thank you.
Please, Alex.
Thank you, friends, and thank you to all of Swedish civil society who have been so involved in organizing the People's Forum. It's so important to continue to have this space for people and civil society to be able to offer their true visions for the types of solutions that we want and need that are based in justice. And given the framing of this session, I also wanted to begin by talking about what the actual problem is, because we need to focus on what the real problem is so as not to be distracted. And focusing on the problem helps us test whether a solution is real and based in justice, or if it's a false solution and a distraction. And the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty campaign, which we also call the Fossil Fuel Treaty campaign, aims to give us a clear demand set focused on the problem. So the problem, put simply, according to the UNEP Production Gap Report, current plans for the production of coal, oil, and gas are more than double what would be consistent with the 1.5 degree target. So that is to say, government's current existing plans for extracting coal, oil, and gas out to 2030 is not at all compatible with our vision for 1.5 degrees. So we need to have a significant change in this coming decade if we are to address coal, oil, and gas. And of course, coal, oil, and gas are responsible for 86% of all CO2 in the atmosphere, or additional CO2 in the atmosphere. So there's the biggest driver of climate change. Another way of looking at this is also to recognize that the existing coal, gas, and oil projects, these are the ones that already have open mines, they are extracting today. They also blow us past 1.5 degrees, and only a 50% chance of it on this graph. So we all know that the question before us this decade is, how do we stop the expansion of the fossil fuel industry and begin to phase down the fossil fuel industry? Another way to look at it is the fact that for the last decade, although we have increased investment in renewables, the actual share of the contribution of global energy demand has barely changed. You might be able to see on the graph, it's gone from 80.3% of fossil fuels to 80.2% fossil fuels. And so what we've been doing for the last decade has not been working, and we need to do something different. So we propose a global agreement on fossil fuel production. We believe if we don't develop a global framework for phasing out fossil fuels, we will make the transition harder. We will risk stranded assets, which are investments that are never going to pay off. And of course, the private sector will try and push the cost of those onto the public. The broader financial turmoil that may be a result of an unplanned and unstructured exit from fossil fuels, with those risks and harms most likely to fall on workers and communities. We know that the political power of the fossil fuel industry is used to delay renewable energy expansion by gobbling up government investment, government subsidies, and access to private capital as well. We know that the fossil fuel industry is delaying economic diversification, so allowing countries and communities that are currently dependent on fossil fuels to leave them for more sustainable sectors. All of this contributes to a fossil fuel industry that is incredibly powerful in locking in its norms economically, politically, legally, as well as culturally. People defining the identity of their areas or their towns through their labor, which may be connected to the fossil fuel industry. And so if we don't address this industry, we are going to risk, we believe, further pushes for dangerous geoengineering, very, very dangerous and risky proposals. And we also risk blowing past 1.5 or even 2 degrees and having even more global heating and even more climate impacts. You may think there's already an international agreement on fossil fuels, but there isn't. The Paris Agreement does not mention fossil fuels once. The Glasgow Pact last year mentioned unabated coal power. That was the first reference to a fossil fuel in the decisions under the Paris Agreement. But there is no focus on coal, oil, or gas production. And what does it mean for economies and countries that are trying to plan for an orderly and just transition from the production of these harmful substances? So we are proposing a global fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty with 3 basic principles underlying it. The first is non-proliferation, which is the idea that we should not add to the problem. First step is to end new exploration and expansion into new reserves. This is an idea that has been called for by civil society for 20 or 30 years and is one that's been supported by the science over that time, and of course is now supported by voices that many would consider much more conservative on these matters, including the International Energy Agency, who have a 1.5 degree pathway, which says clearly there's no needed investment in new fossil fuel infrastructure, or the Secretary General of the United Nations himself, who has said that it is environmental and economic madness to invest in any new fossil fuels. So that's the first pillar of what we need to do. The second is what we call disarmament. So we need to reduce the existing threat of fossil fuels, which means coming up with an equitable plan to phase out production, which will require negotiation between countries to help determine what is equitable, given historical contributions to the problem, the history of overconsumption in the north, and the history of extraction and colonialism of the global south from the global north. And the third pillar to help realize that is the global just transition. So these cannot be dealt with apart from the other two. It's not that we can simply end our plans for expansion and then plan a phase out. We also need to be ensuring that we are resourcing our phase out to be just. And Nicholas mentioned that he'd been involved in a series of workshops last year looking at this question. And I think there were 3 key elements we think are particularly important for the global just transition. So it must ensure energy access for all so that people can lead a dignified life. And that means getting out of not just fossil fuels, but the corporate controlled, privatized, centralized energy systems that define energy systems globally today and have left billions of people without any energy or far too little energy. The second is to support economic diversification in countries and communities that are dependent on fossil fuels, whether that's replacement for income for social services or it's for more productive economic activity. And the third is ensuring that the transition and the planning occurs in a just manner through a social dialogue between the most impacted people, their workers, their unions, and the community and state involved in doing so. And all 3 of these elements, a global norm of no new fossil fuels, a global plan for equitable phase out, and global support for a just transition, are missing in our international governance and discussions. And we are calling for the Stockholm Plus 50 conference to recognize this gap urgently. So the Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative is a civil society initiative. Many of the organizations that make up the global climate movement are members of the network. There are over almost 1,500 organizations from every continent. And we want to work to change the norms on fossil fuels, to provide the missing frameworks and mechanisms in global governance, and to help grow the movement for a just energy transition by making sure that in our demands on fossil fuel supply, we center the needs of equity and analysis that leads with solutions. So we are working to motivate cities, local governments, states, and national governments to endorse this idea. We're working to increase transparency and accountability on plans for fossil fuel production with our research plan. And we work to complement and in concert with the existing campaigns in our movement on frontline resistance to fossil fuel projects and on the finance campaigns that are cutting off the money for these projects. So what I hope to set up with this opening introduction is to give you a little bit more context about the Fossil Fuel Treaty campaign, but also to situate it as being focused clearly on the problem being the plans of the fossil fuel industry to expand production at the very moment we must be decreasing it. And any action that doesn't focus on that question, how do we decrease our use, our transport, and our extraction of fossil fuels, is not a real solution to the climate crisis. If you are interested in finding out more about the Fossil Fuel Treaty campaign, you can join us. We have a campaign hub, which is designed to allow anybody and everybody to start getting involved in this people-driven campaign. And there are a couple more links available. The overarching website is there, and I believe there's a Swedish version that links off it as well. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much, Alex, for that. And we'll get back, of course. You can add in points and respond to also what other people say. There's a lot to say about the treaty, obviously. So much happening and so much different kinds of support also happening as we speak. Cities and academics and parliamentarians and many people all over the world who are joining in to call for such a treaty. We'll just move on here and then we'll get into more of a discussion. So I'll ask Dipti to now take the floor. And as I said, Dipti is based in Mozambique, has been working across the board on fighting bad, dangerous distractions for solutions, but also, I think, increasingly focusing also herself as well as the network and the organization she's with on real solutions, and not least on the kinds of renewable energy that we'd like to see, recognizing that the next battlefront after we've defeated the fossil fuel industry will certainly be the one between good and bad renewables, good and bad solutions, so to say. And I think Dipti has a lot of very recent findings to share from the work they've been doing with Friends of the Earth International and allies. So please, Dipti, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nicholas. Very nice to be on the panel with everyone today. So in terms of solutions, what is the world that we want to build together? We definitely need to stop the dirty energy system. We need to take on the logic of fossil fuels. Of course, we need to stop the battles wherever they are happening, coal, oil, and gas, wherever they are popping up. We also need to tackle the logic of the way that the industry operates with complete impunity. And then we do need energy. We see energy as a human right. It's an absolute must for people to live a life of dignity, as Alex just said. But how is that? What does that energy system look like? So we came up with many years ago, 4 years ago, we developed as Friends of the Earth International, People Power Now Energy Manifesto. What are the principles that must underpin the energy system that we want to see? And it's critical that it has certain elements like, where are the materials coming from? Whose land are solar panels or wind farms being put on? And are those communities receiving energy? And are they a part of the decision making that went into that energy system and those energy processes? We talk about energy sufficiency for all, so that everyone has energy, what they need to use, and no one has too little and no one is abusing it. Obviously, these are principles that we want to follow in the energy system that we want to see. Energy as a common good, not as not as a commodity, but as a basic human right, so that everyone can access it. Of course, we need 100% renewable energy, but for everyone, not just for the elites who can afford to buy solar panels and put it on their roofs. So, and of course, just transition is a really, really important part of that. A transition that protects workers and also the communities that they're located in, because in most of the global south, the just transition conversation cannot just be about the workers, the unionized workers in fossil fuel infrastructure, has to be about the communities which get tied to that infrastructure and also need a way to transition to a different livelihood, because livelihood is really critical. So we've been doing some work on the energy system that we want to see, the principles for that. And last year we released our report called a Just Recovery Renewable Energy Plan for Africa. So of course, just recovery from the pandemic, from the situation that we all find ourselves in globally, but to have a renewable energy plan for Africa, of course, as one of the continents with some of the lowest levels of electrification. So in Mozambique, about 70% of the people do not have access to electricity. These are dire numbers when we think about energy needed as a human right for people to live lives of dignity. So we developed this Just Recovery Renewable Energy Plan for Africa, where we're looking at modeling from Australian academic Sven Teska. And so the plan calls for 300 gigawatts of new renewable energy by 2030 and 2,000 gigawatts by 2050. And just to contrast the numbers for you, in 2016, 6 years ago, Africa the entire continent used 168 gigawatts of energy. 168 gigawatts. What is needed for the people? Basic energy sufficiency for all, 300 gigawatts by 2030 and 2,000 plus gigawatts by 2050. So our plan, based on the modeling of Sven Teska, shows that this renewable energy potential exists in Africa, and it can meet people's needs, and it can support job growth as well. So this renewable energy plan has the potential to create 7 million jobs. It is economically and technically feasible. It is the political implementation, as always, that is extremely lacking. And then maybe to talk about some of the other solutions that we need to see as part of this movement to transition away from fossil fuels and towards the world that we all want to build. So repayment of the climate debt from the global north to the global south is going to be an extremely important part of this transition, because the finance is going to be needed in the global south to be able to have the renewable energy. And of course, it needs to be a people-centered renewable energy system, but there is going to be needed some finance for that. And, for those in the global south to be able to come on this transition. So repayment of the climate debt is a really important part of what we advocate, along with the transition of the energy system. There are also some food and land solutions that we talk about. So you're going to hear very soon from our colleagues about the myth of net zero and the false solutions, the carbon markets, and all of these sort of carbon unicorns that are put forward by industry and others, by polluters who do not want to stop polluting. You're going to hear more about that. And to safeguard against that, we actually need to protect communities whose lands are at stake and whose lands are going to be targeted and grabbed for companies to be able to do their offsetting projects. So to counter that, we need to talk about rights for indigenous peoples, rights for local communities, peasants that are living and using ecosystems to keep their communities alive. This is really critical. And to support community forest management and peasant agroecology as the ways that local communities already nourish themselves in many cases. We also need to talk about some economic justice solutions as part of this work that we want to do. We need to support a new economics for people and planet, one that values care work and reorganizes care work to be shared between women, men, and the state. We also need to reclaim the public sphere to make sure that people have, that there is support for public services and people can access very basic public services like health, education, transport, communication, etc. And the last economic justice solution would be that we need to call for a binding treaty on big business, a binding treaty on transnational corporations, including the fossil fuel corporations, but not only. Of course, they need to be part of that. And we need to hold companies responsible for the crimes that they're committing against people, and they need to be held to account. And this process is going on with a process to get a binding treaty on transnational corporations. So these need to be some of the solutions that need to come along with the energy transformation that we need to see. And I wanted to just share some of the big picture thinking that is happening at Friends of the Earth, and of course in so many other amazing spaces. And we need a change of mindsets. We need to be showing solidarity. I think that's a really important value that needs to come along in all of our struggles. My struggle is your struggle is my struggle. What does that look like? How do we support each other? How do we connect up our struggles? And that's the change in value system that I think is really important and really much needed. And in Southern Africa, from the Bantu languages, there's a value system called Ubuntu, which is I am because we are. And it's that human interconnectedness that I feel really needs to be a part of the work that we're doing in the energy transformation, and in all the system change work that we're doing is to center justice and to center the value of Ubuntu. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dipti, for that. Yes, adding a lot of things on the table for further conversations. I'll hand over straight away to Teresa Anderson, who'll pick up on what Dipti just mentioned, and particularly look at the challenges and problems with the very fashionable net zero discourse that we've seen taking off very significantly in the last few years. So please, Teresa.
Sorry. Hi, that works, right? Okay, great. So you had Dipti talking about alluding very quickly to the issue of net zero. And you've probably been hearing how net zero targets have become all the rage. Here in Sweden, the government's announced a net zero target. They're very proud of it. And, it seems like civil society, well, much of civil society, and can I get this back somehow?
The presentation.
Civil society, governments, corporations, media, the public, everybody seems to, be buying into the idea that net zero targets are synonymous with ambitious climate action. And COP26, which was in Glasgow in the UK, about 6 months ago now, the UK government as the host was all for, pushing governments and corporations to announce net zero targets. And there was this big momentum, the net zero COP. And we've seen in the last few years the UK, the EU, Canada, France, Shell, New Zealand, Sweden, and many other countries announce net zero targets, as well as corporations like the fossil fuel industry, the food industry, airlines, cement, mining, steel, dairy, all sorts of corporations are announcing net zero targets. So everyone's assuming, great, the more net zero targets we have, the better, right? We're really on track for solving this climate problem. But actually, no. In fact, the opposite is true. And that's because, well, for a lot of reasons, net zero targets are being used to delay urgent action. I mean, we see these targets are being announced for net zero by 2050, or in Sweden's case, net zero by 2040. This is like nearly 25 or 30 years' time. And that means like continuing inaction for like another 20 or 30 years. These targets allow polluters to continue greenwashing, business as usual. In most cases, these targets rely on technologies that don't even exist yet. They just hope at some point a technology is going to be invented that can fix the solution. So that means they can carry on right now anyway. For ActionAid, my organization, we're a social justice development organization, human rights, working in 45 countries, most of which are in the global south. And we're really concerned that net zero targets are going to end up driving vast land grabs, especially in the global south. And basically, because it's impossible to achieve the net carbon offsetting component of all these net zero targets, they're likely to they can't happen. So basically, you'll have a lot of noise about net zero, about solving the climate crisis, but an inevitable failure to prevent runaway climate catastrophe. And so let's take a step back. I mean, we've heard from our colleagues, Alex and Dipti, what do we really need to avoid going over the threshold of 1.5 degrees warming? Well, we need to minimize the total amount of CO2 that's just being put into the atmosphere. We don't want to be putting stuff into the air and then relying on some other system to take it out. We want to stop polluting in the first place. And that means restructuring, totally restructuring our energy systems, our agriculture, our housing, our transport, our industrial and our economic systems. And we need to start today. We need to be bringing global greenhouse gas emissions down to as close to zero as possible, whilst also protecting and restoring biodiverse ecosystems and protecting, rights while we do so. And that means we need ambitious milestones, for 2025 and 2030, so that we can radically cut greenhouse gases. This doesn't mean waiting until 2050 to solve the problem. And this also means that the wealthy polluting countries that have done the most to cause the climate crisis have to act first. They have to do their fair share, and they have to provide climate finance so that lower income countries can be supported to transition to greener pathways. Now, net zero sounds good, sounds a lot like zero emissions, doesn't it? So that's why people are celebrating it. But if you look at this little diagram, it shows all the different options of what net zero can really mean, right? So you could have 0 tons of CO2, minus 0 tons of CO2, that still gives you net zero CO2. But if you have 10 tons of CO2 and you somehow manage to subtract 10 tons of CO2, that gives you net zero CO2. You see where I'm going with this, right? So if you have 100 or 1,000 tons of CO2 pollution, that means if you promise to subtract 100 or 1,000 tons of CO2 from the atmosphere, you can theoretically get also to net zero CO2. But these two words, net zero, they're the same, whatever scenario, even though these are totally, totally different pathways to getting there. And really, which version of the net zero pathway makes a huge difference on whether this target is meaningful for the climate or achievable. And so we shouldn't accept net zero targets at face value, because the net in net zero just needs to be really scrutinized. How big is that net? How are we supposed to remove the carbon from the atmosphere? And when we do so, who's that going to impact? And is it even possible? Because the bigger the net, i.e. the more carbon offsets, the more carbon capture, the more dangerous the implications. And in most cases, it really is heavy greenwash. So how do we normally remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere? Well, really protecting and restoring biodiverse ecosystems are our only realistic option. But, Earth only has a certain amount of land capacity. We don't have extra planets on which to plant trees. And in actually most government and corporate targets just assume that we have infinite land available to plant more trees on. Completely unrealistic assumptions about carbon offsets and tree plantations. They're also talking about technology idea, fantasy unicorn, as Dipti said, of bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, BECCS, which is the idea that we'll cut down forests and burn them, but we'll store that CO2 underground and everything will be fine. Well, that that involves cutting trees down, so not a great idea. And B, the technology to store that CO2 underground may never work. I mean, they've invested billions, hundreds of billions in it, and it still hasn't worked, and it may never work. I've lost my slide. Where is it? Oh. Or they're basically hoping that at some point in the future, somebody else will involve a new technology and then it will be fine. So really all of the net targets added together come to far more than the Earth's capacity. There is not enough land on the planet to net off all these net targets. And we see that global South communities are going to be paying the price of land grabs and carbon colonialism yet again. And we saw this with the biofuel land grab of previous years. And we fear it's happening again. So in conclusion, this is just a quick graph, which I won't go into, about different scenarios and the assumptions. But basically, net zero targets are dangerous, are being used to greenwash business as usual. You know, net zero by 2050 is too little, too late. This relies on land to suck carbon out the air, and it's going to drive vast land grabs and cause hunger. And all the nets added together come to more than the world can achieve. So we need to scrutinize these net zero targets. We cannot accept them at face value, and we need to minimize reliance on this idea of removing carbon dioxide from the air, because our only option is to reduce emissions at source through real and radical transformation, and we can't get caught in the net. Thank you.
Thank you, Teresa, for that. We are hence seeing now a really alarming situation where these suggested sort of solutions that really aren't solutions, that in effect are creating a delay, an evasion, a way to escape the radical, transformational, systemic change that we need, is driving us into a situation where we're getting into more and more of a sort of panic situation, right? This idea even of a carbon budget is something to really think about quite carefully, because there's really no budget left. We're way over any safety already. There's really no alternative to drastically change and stop polluting, which is what Alex talks about, a treaty to make sure that we stop production of fossil fuels. Now, with these net zero targets and other things, this is kind of allowed to continue. And as Teresa said, and I think also Dipti mentioned, the idea of sucking up after it's been polluted into trees or in machines or other ways is, of course, very, very problematic. It's not realistic, and it has many, many side effects, consequences on communities, on ecosystems, etc. Now, that's bad enough, but what happens when it continues to get delayed, the changes we need to do, and people start talking about some really drastic measures to not even address the abundance, the too much carbon dioxide in the air by sucking it down, but actually trying to stop the sun from heating. So that's the idea of solar geoengineering, to dim the sun by spewing particles, for example, up into the atmosphere, mimicking volcano eruptions that evidently decrease the heating. There's a lower average temperature, but of course it's further destabilized. It's a very, very disturbed system already. And the attitude that goes along with that in terms of thinking that you can control this and in some kind of planetary geoengineering measure, dial down and mitigate a problem that is already so vast. And that's exactly what we're now fearing will become something that is not just a crazy idea, but something that gets normalized into real deployment and locking in the whole world into something that very few have had a say about. And it got really close to us last year when we found out about an experiment being planned for the north of Sweden on Sami territory. And I'll let now Åsa Larsson-Blind from the Sami Council take the stage to share more about how they got involved and successfully countered this particular experiment as a very important measure to stop the normalization, and of course also getting a very critical debate going across the world, really, and also was in pretty much every major news outlet and TV show last year around this. So Åsa, please share some reflections from from you on this and other related aspects, obviously, when it comes to real and false solutions.
Thank you so much, Niklas, for that introduction, and I hope you all hear me. I also want to thank all the previous interventions from the panel, from giving very interesting and very bringing so many thoughts in my mind when speaking to you now. As Niklas said, we came very close to the solar geoengineering technology last year, and I have to say that was our first. I work for Sami Council. It's an NGO, an IPO, Indigenous Peoples Organization, and we work to promote Sami and Indigenous rights and the right to culture and the right to our lands and territories. And by doing so, our main priority, it is to secure the natural ecosystems and the restoration of the natural ecosystems, because our territories are what sustains us, because our traditional livelihoods depend on our natural surroundings. And so that has been is our primary goal and our priority. So in that sense, we haven't been into this technological side of the climate change discussion before. As Niklas said, we were alarmed last year in February that it was testing planned in Giron, in Kiruna. And at first we didn't really understand what it was about, but so it was a very quick learning curve. But when we understood that, as Niklas said, it was almost like manufacturing a great giant volcano outbreak, we quite instinctively reacted that you don't do that to nature, you don't do that to Mother Earth. That contradicts what we believe is respectful. And since our need now, as also we have heard before by the panelists, we need to sort out and to phase out all these false solutions, and we need to focus on what we know now and have been knowing for quite some time, what is needed to actually target the root causes of climate change. And this new technology of solar geoengineering is not doing that. It's not a solution to actually target the causes of climate change. It's only a matter of treating the symptoms. So from our perspective, this is not a solution for the future, and thus nothing that we should put our time and effort on. And we see the great danger that it takes the focus out of what we really need to do and the urgency in actually cutting emissions and actually treating the causes of climate change. And this is something that we have raised, because when we heard about this ScopeX and we reacted and we sent letters together with great allies, other indigenous organizations and environmental organizations, we managed to stop the testing, and we have had many reactions to that. So we've heard many reactions of that. These were really small tests, and we know that, and that these tests were not causing any environmental consequences. Yes, and we know that. But what is the reason that we actually wanted to stop those tests planned in Giron was that it is part of a bigger goal to develop the technology of solar geoengineering. And that is not something that Sami Council as an organization, with our priorities of securing natural ecosystems and securing the basis of our traditional livelihoods and our culture, that is not a priority for us. So we raised our voice and said that this is not part of our chosen future. We do not want the tests like this legitimizing this development on our territory. And we were successful together with our allies in stopping this. But the discussion has been ongoing. And I can say that it's a tremendous interest in these technologies. And I see why, because this technology is pictured to have kind of a quick fix to the climate crisis, as of being kind of a plan B. With all the urgency report of how far we have let the climate crisis actually go, and the short time frame we have now at actually succeeding, people are very keen on finding a solution that makes it less urgent. And this is what I see is the great risk with this, because we know that it's so hard. We've seen this up until now, so hard to mobilize for the needed action. And what if we now get a plan B, the notion of a plan B, because no one knows if this actually works and no one can calculate for the consequences. But the notion of a plan B that can actually give one more reason to the big economic interests behind fossil fuel industries to just lean back a bit and say that, okay, but we'll wait just a bit to see, maybe we don't need to do this transition. Maybe we can continue business as usual. And that might be actually what makes us not reach the targets. So that's the bigger picture that I see is a great risk with this discussion of technology as a quick fix and the salvation in the climate crisis, because it is merely treating the symptoms. So that is kind of the main background for us involving in this discussion and keep raising our voice and discussing this issue. Not because it will affect us as indigenous peoples more than others, but because it will also affect us. And we have been advocating for climate action for a very long time. Sami Council, other Sami organizations, and indigenous peoples around the world. And so we will also engage in these discussions of what not to do. So I think I will stop there, and looking forward to hearing the others in the panels and maybe a discussion afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Åsa, for that very key framing. And of course, there's a lot of juicy details to this particular struggle and the case, which there's also some quite a lot to read about from all the coverage that happened. I will get back to that, I'm sure. I'll let Cecilia now take the floor as our last panelist. I already introduced you. You have many hats, and again, you've been following this. I think you followed this very keenly, the fight of Åsa and others up in Kiruna, but you've also been very much involved in many other struggles directly, and have some reflections to share. So I'll let you take the floor, Sila.
Hello. No.
Yeah.
Yes, hello. Yes, thank you a lot for the talks before. And I just start to, oh, this is a picture, not should be. Now? No. Okay, first I talk a little about the Fossil Fuel Treaty. I'm not alone working with this in Sweden. There's a lot of people done a lot, like Lania Rashid, Hanna Johansson, Peter Forsberg, Fred Eriksson, Julia, Herberling, yeah. We work into 3 cities like Stockholm, Gothenburg, and Malmö, and we've done a lot of active works, and it's been very interesting because the people understand it very quickly. This treaty that is very forceful and that it could be a very strong tool. So, like a lot of groups have endorsed it. And then I will talk about some other things that is more like a real big refinery. It's situated in Lysekil and in Gothenburg, called Premraf. And I'm also one of them that have been working against that, because they want, the story was that 2 years ago, Premraf and Lysekil demanded that they be allowed to increase their emission in order to refine cheapest, thickest Russian oil for petrol and diesel. But it was a very, very strong opposition from the environment movement. And we were working very well together, like a lot of organization. And finally, Prem eventually withdraw the application. And it was really like we celebrated, we were so happy. And we had been like cycling across this country, a lot of boats out. It's been like orchestrating a lot of groups together, really well done. But it was just for, I don't know, maybe 1 day or something, because it was another plan. And the other plan was that it should start to have this biofuel instead in Lysekil and Gothenburg. So now in April 26, we went down again to meet the court about that they should be able to rebuild this refinery to have this biofuel. And just 1 day before, we heard on the news, it was all over, that Premraf got this extraordinary big favorable grant, 3.5 billion, just the day before. It's like, okay, what's happening here? But anyhow, we went down and said no, because we know that biofuel is not the solution. It's actually a very false solution, because it's also have a lot of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, the same. And we were informed a bit more detailed, and it was very complex. It's very hard to understand, but the main thing is that they put slaughter waste from the forest and also from rapeseeds together, and you put it in a very small percentage in all the petrol, and so you can continue to do the same, like the same infrastructure. You don't have to change. You can just go to the petrol station and you think you make something green. Actually, they got the prize, I think last year or something, greenwashing prize, Prem. Yeah, congratulations. Well, yes. And so we have in Sweden something called reduction obligation. It sounds very complicated. Everything about the forest is very complicated and a lot of numbers here and there. So you put some percentage into the petrol, and this should be increasing and should be tripled by 2030 or something. I think it has stopped now because it was so expensive, but it will continue because they build all this refinery. And what I want to say, it's very close to the forest industry, because the forest company also have high expectation of to market, to sell this. And they want to have 1.5 terawatt of biofuels, and they want to increase it and have like 10 10 terawatt by 2030. I'm sorry, I'm not so good at all this, but now I'll show you some picture here. The first picture, no, it's not, no, one more, there, yeah. So we in Stoppa Premraff, we start to educate ourselves about biofuel and to know about, and we make this fairy tale about biofuel and what you need to know about it. And next. So it's a lot of words here, you can see. It's a lot about how it, it's very sustainable. We never had so much forest before, and so on. The reduction obligation. And the thing is, a kind of a mess. And so we take the next picture. So when someone explains it, it's like, what is biofuel? You fall asleep, kind of. And that's the message. You shouldn't understand it so well, but calm down. It is very actually easy, like I explained. Like they just put biofuel into the petrol, diesel, a percentage, and they want to increase it, and they want to make it more in Sweden. That's the whole plan with all the grants. And now we take the next. So we started to work with other groups to learn, like Greenpeace have a lot of knowledge, and also protect the forest. So how does it work? And like here you see clear cut, and everything is destroyed, and it's leak a lot of carbon dioxide. And what we do in Sweden, we have this plantation. That's small trees down there. So, and I will show you the last picture, which is what we did is this, like, okay, we don't want to put out the fire. We don't want to just burn our trees in the cars. That's actually what a lot of things is going to be. And you don't have any leftover if you don't cut down anything. That's a thing. And not a slaughterhouse, what is called leftovers. Yeah, I don't know. We call it leftovers. Yeah, that's also going into the cars. I don't think people know exactly what it is that's going into the cars. So, and the last thing I want to speak about is, like, a lot of people are very much engaged in groups and movements, like supporting, for example, Fridays for Future is a group called People for Future. It's like a response for like adults, and also is Parents for Future, and Parents for Future International is coming here to Stockholm now. And we have Preachers for Future, Psychologists for Future here. And we have a lot of groups, and we try to support the young, because the next generation, how it should be solved now. They shouldn't solve it. We should solve it. And we should go together and work together and make a big mobilization, everyone. Yeah, I think I stop there. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Silla, for that expose, really, of various struggles that, of course, are intertwined. And that's the whole thing. I think that's the whole point of this session, too, that we have to follow the problems. They reappear in new shapes. Need to see through the nice words, and everything's connected, and so do we need to be connected as we work, and hence wear a lot of hats, and also know each other, and I think that's what's happening increasingly, and that's certainly what will happen again in just about a week's time, when we have our People's Forum in this very building, as we said in the beginning, where so many different kinds of issues and movements are coming together, and of course our hope and conviction here is that there will be a lot of cross-fertilization, a lot of cross-issue strategizing. And after 2 years of not even having much face-to-face meetings, that will certainly be very valuable. I will see here what...
One question, but I don't know how to get copies.
So I think we'll we're inviting questions from the cyberspace, and also to allow the speakers to also, of course, interact here. And I'm sure there are some ideas and things that have been triggered from the previous speakers, Alex and Dipti, and also of course from what you've heard, and Teresa here. I'd be keen to hear if there is any reflection from Alex, for example, who started, on what you've heard here, because you've now been working so much on the treaty, and in this kind of pushing this real solution, but also being very much aligned with the people fighting the frontline struggles against fossil fuels, but also seeing these false solutions. And you did mention that the treaty has this kind of just transition piece as well, which really bridges to what Dipti talked about. And I guess one question I would have to you is, when you come, this is really global effort, and it's a very radical message, because everybody needs to stop in different pace perhaps, but everybody needs to stop. How does it get across to, say, poorer countries that feel they have been really screwed? There's a huge inequity here. They sit on lots of fossil fuels, and now with the whole war too, and the prices going up, there's a potential earning here that they should rightfully have the possibility to exploit perhaps. And how do you see that in terms of giving the message that there's a better way, and how can the treaty address that whole dilemma that they find themselves with, as one example of a question? But you might have other things also that you'd like to reflect on, Alex.
Thank you, Nicholas. And yeah, I mean, the first thing to say is that the fossil fuel industry has had almost 200 years selling itself as the deliverer of modernity and of wealth. And we live in a world that does not have shared wealth for most people, and does not have energy access for most people, which should make us pause and wonder what the truth is about fossil fuels. Because the idea that fossil fuels and fossil fuel extraction leads to wealth seems to be quite disproved in many circumstances. And Dipti could speak more clearly about what has happened in Mozambique since the discovery of a huge gas field there, but the result has not been an increase in prosperity for most people. I live and work in Colombia, and the regions that have the largest coal extraction are also the regions that are generally the most impoverished, with the least access to energy and lowest levels of health and educational outcomes and so on. So the idea that there is some direct connection between fossil fuels and prosperity and health, I think has been disproved by experience. And in fact, the Fossil Fuel Treaty, along with many of our partners, will be releasing a report on the 1st of June, outlining the ways in which fossil fuels actually actively fuel the failure of our sustainable development agenda. If we look at the types of goals we set to try and make the world a healthier or more prosperous place, what we see is that fossil fuels undermine all of those objectives. They lead to less participatory or democratic governance systems. They pollute local air and local water. They don't deliver energy access. And of course, they fuel the climate crisis, the plastics crisis, and the biodiversity crisis. So they're a real challenge. That said, there are many nations and communities that do currently rely on fossil fuel production for government income, which they use to provide, to some extent, government services and social services. And it's a real challenge for those places to be able to say, well, yes, we will stop extracting fossil fuels. We will forego a potential government revenue, which we have currently, structured into our plan for governments, and structured into our plan for applying for international finance, and structured into our plans for repaying currently, odious and burdensome international debt, for them to say out of nothing, well, we'll just go it alone and unilaterally declare no new fossil fuels here. So that's why the treaty tries to make a distinction to say clearly no new fossil fuels needs to be a norm for everybody, but it's the governments and the states that have profited the most of the existing system which need to show leadership. So the idea that the United States of America can in any forum, in any place, describe themselves as a leader on climate, or that Canada could do the same, or that Norway could do the same, when these are sites of plans for new fossil fuel extraction in this decade, really highlights the challenge that we're in. And so then there are people and political movements and governments across the South point at places like Norway. We've recently seen in elections in Costa Rica, and say if that's the model that Norway has had, then that's the model that Costa Rica could also have. And Costa Rica currently doesn't extract fossil fuels, but they have drawn on the example of Norway to try and justify opening fracking in Costa Rica. So if we want to see a real global movement of governments that are coming together to end the fossil fuel industry, then we need to have a conception of equity and fairness at the heart of it. It cannot simply be everybody stops at the same time, at the same pace, without any idea about cooperation, support, and reparations for the harms and damages caused by the history of extraction. So that's why we have in our proposal the three pillars where we talk about setting the norm of ending expansion, considering what an equitable phase out is, and then ensuring that there is a just transition, which includes the needs for cooperation, solidarity, and support to realize the change. I would be quite interested in asking us or others in terms of the Scopex campaign, which were the issues or the messages that you felt best connected with people and got them most engaged in this campaign?
Thank you. Thank you, Alex, for that. And just to also connect to one of the questions we got here from the audience online, talks about Renee talking about the sort of is it not a necessary decline in GDP and the consequences of that from reducing fossil fuels? And I think you partly answered that, Alex. And I think also just to emphasize that what is really key here, and also I think very encouraging and liberating in a way, and also very much integrated with the Fossil Fuel Treaty framing, is that we're really talking about not just a swap of fuels, we're talking about a very different development model. And luckily, with the stroke of luck, coincidental, the renewable energy sources and technologies that we need, solar, wind, small hydro, geothermal, they tend to be prone to be democratized. They tend to be conducive to decentralized, small-scale distributed production, like nuclear power and big-scale stuff, which needs militarization, huge capital, are produced in one big space, and very, very concentrated sort of power and capital sort of as a necessity is not really there for renewables. They can be, and that's part back to the realization we had in the beginning that could be bad for renewables. But there is a potential for a different kind of system of energy production that can be leading to a different kind of economy, a local development kind of economy that can generate wealth and well-being, and possibly also share economic growth, of course, but also with other kind of measures of what really is important. And I think that's part of the narrative that we're seeing, and that's of course what Dipti talked a lot about from the work they've been doing in redefining an African development agenda based on people-centered renewable energy as the alternative to the fossil fuel centralized and very concentrated system. But back to, I think, Åsa, as you were given a direct question there from Alex in terms of what worked, but also seeing that I think you had some you wanted to also reflect on what Dipti said on just transition. So I'll hand over to you, Åsa, so you can sort of package that together.
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Alex. Yeah, many thoughts from the very interesting comments. And I think as I will get back to also Alex's question, and I think that will I will put it in here. But I want to start by commenting on what Dipti said in her presentation earlier about the need to actually question the system that we have now and what we are promoting. And as you mentioned, the need to respect the rights and bring in the perspectives of marginalized groups, and that human rights, we need to kind of bring back the values that we want to promote, and question the basics in the faulty system that we have now, and that human rights need to be it needs to be the foundation that we do not jeopardize, and then as an outset then talk about how can we then have can talk about what a sustainable society would look like. And because now we see, as for us indigenous peoples, unfortunately we are still fighting for the possibility to participate in the discussions. We are still, just look at the last COP, that was a kind of a step forward, but still we are still not recognized as an equal part in the discussions. So we are actually kept from contributing to the solutions. And as Alex mentioned, biodiversity crisis is a great part of also the climate crisis. And it has been shown that within indigenous peoples' traditional territories, the biodiversity is actually declining less rapid than in other parts of the world. So we can see that there are teachings in indigenous peoples' traditional livelihoods. There are values there, and there are ways of and a worldview of sustainable resource use that we can contribute with. But when we do not have actually access to influence the decisions, we cannot secure our rights, we can't secure our cultures, but we cannot contribute and bring our good solutions to the table. So we need to, for kind of all society's sake, bring in these perspectives that can be part of the solution. So, and I would say that that was maybe the part that made also people attached to our discussion about ScopeX. Not the technological specificities of that technology, but the main and broader discussion of that we need to talk of climate justice, when we need to talk about what is actually the solutions that we want to see for the future. And that was what we also joined together with other indigenous peoples in our open letter to Harvard and to ScopeX, on that we want to talk about the real solutions. And this is not one of them. And that was what was our main message in this, and also the ScopeX discussion. So actually we see it as a detour. We would like to talk about what Alex and also Dipti is talking about. What are the real solutions? what is the pathway for the future. But we are kept in these loops of force that are forcing us to kind of discuss what we do not want to see. So I would say that I hope that was the answer to also Alex's question. Thank you.
What was very interesting, and also just mentioned that how you took the successful fight against this project, this geoengineering experiment up in Sápmi, away from sort of your backyard or your territory, straight to the heart of Harvard and where this project came from, and challenged them at their home turf, which I think was just brilliant way of really showing also that this wasn't just about you not wanting something in your backyard, but this is wrong for everyone everywhere. And I think that was also powerful in the letter where you said, you know, this can only proceed if there's absolutely full consensus, which of course will never happen. But that's really the principle you would need to have for something that is so totalitarian, so existentially dangerous as solar geoengineering. And that was really a powerful argument that was turned back on them. And also to reflect that the other side has become also quite sophisticated in taking our narratives. So the appropriation of justice and climate justice, for example, and saying that if you're fighting this, you're denying, intergenerational justice because you're not allowing these potential technologies as solutions to be applied in the future by young people, and that's wrong. While in effect, as you said, also, by even talking about them, you foreclose possibilities of actually getting to the real solutions, because you allow the fossil fuel industry to continue and you allow these sort of business as usual to happen. And then we're stuck in an impossible situation of global warming and many other problems. But that kind of twisting of narratives and appropriation of terms is something we see increasingly, I think, as just a general comment. I wonder if we have anyone else here, Teresa or Sila, who wants to say. And also we have a question from the audience. Yes.
What is the current strategy now? We are now. Alex mentioned there is a struggle now in Norway where the climate activists are trying to educate
so we're getting some sound here for those who are listening in.
Yeah.
So Norway, the question is, where are we?
The
Norway.
labor movement in Norway doesn't want to discuss this at all, about the fossil fuels of Norway. Here in Sweden, we have a very strange political situation. Neither the political parties nor the voters here in Sweden at this very moment, even if every day fossil fuels are discussed in the war in Ukraine, the Russian oil and everything, but even so, neither the public or the political parties seem to be interested in the climate crisis. There are so many gallops now that tell us this, and it breaks the heart of every climate activist at the moment. So what is are there strategic discussions within this initiative, and what are they? How do we continue to get the rich countries on board to try to influence our local situation here?
So I'm not sure if it all came through, but basically,
But did you get what
we got
I'm
what you
talking
said,
about?
and the problem of Norway, and also
And on Sweden.
in Sweden, the lack of interest
Yeah.
for climate, and with the war and so on taking the stage and crowding out a lot of these conversations. And I think, just to say, there was some interesting climate feature in the Australian election just now, where that kind of actually made a big difference. And of course, Alex is actually from Australia, so he's probably quite upbeat about that. But Sila, you've been spending a lot of time in Norway too, and you're really working here and being quite connected to, I think, where people are. How do we get this up?
For example, in Norway, it's I know a lot of climate activists there, and it's very hard because, I mean, your aunt, your everyone is working in the oil industry, kind of. And but now, for example, Extinction Rebellion start to be much active, and it's got into the media, and they start to actually get the point of you just destroy this. What about us, the next generation? And I think it's going to be more and more. And they are trying to sue the government. It's a paragraph in their law, 112. It's called. And it was Greenpeace, grandparents, etc. And but now it has some effect even in the government. But of course, like everything now, because of the crisis about, okay, where should we get the fossil fuel? Okay, we get it from Norway, even if it's expensive. And also, I really have to point out that we continue when we have put just biofuel, and we make a lot of destruction with biological diversity everywhere in all the country. But I just think, like I said, we need really to mobilize and not stop trying to mobilize and connect to each other, work together and collaborate and learn and educate each other about how everything is working. Okay, very good answer. I don't know. Oh, yeah.
Thank you, Sila. That's great. Teresa.
Yeah, I can also reflect a bit on your thoughts. I definitely agree with you that that sometimes it feels like this climate momentum, it comes in waves, and then sometimes it feels it disappears, but then something happens and it comes again, and we feel like this is the moment where we can push it through. And I felt that many times, the momentum and the disappearance many times over the years. Certainly after COP, it felt like, wow, we've not only reframed the language about net zero, because it felt like we did actually do a lot to change expectations, and we're creating a space for real zero and real solutions to be on the table. And then the war in Ukraine happened, and it felt like that story has disappeared. And contrarily, that many politicians are saying, give us more oil now, because which we do, as the climate movement, have the opportunity to do more to get better at pulling the solutions together, because we know that the resilience to the climate crisis, the solutions to get us more resilient to issues like Ukraine and the fuel scarcity and rising food prices are the same solutions that are going to address the climate crisis. So by shifting to renewable energy, we're less vulnerable to rising fuel prices, right? By shifting to agroecology, we're less vulnerable to rising food prices, caused by the fertilizer prices which are rising due to fuel. So it's a big part of the solution. It turns out that climate solutions are actually part of our solutions to conflict and global insecurity, and we need to do more to bring these together and center them in the narrative. And I suspect that civil society will start getting this act together, hopefully better this year. I would say that we the point about the just transition is it has the potential to turn people who were formerly opposing climate action to be the most powerful advocates for it. In ActionAid, we did some development of principles for a just transition in other sectors, like in agriculture and extractives. And we realized that most just transitions have across them, like they should really have 4 principles at heart. One is that a just transition has to address and not exacerbate inequality. And so it shouldn't be leading to land grabs like biofuels or disrupted climate like Scopex and solar radiation management. It needs to transform the system to work for people and nature and the climate. And it needs to have inclusive and participatory processes. So we kept on hearing about participation in this session. And it needs to have like the framework that helps people, supports people to make that shift. And we find that if you apply those 4 principles, then people can actually feel, if people feel reassured that there is something on the other side, that they're supported to make that shift to a better lifestyle than currently being exploited as a coal miner, then they can actually become the most powerful advocates for that transition. And so that's why these, we're bringing these stories together now and drawing alliances. And really that's the goal of the movement. So we have to center justice at the same time as we normalize the radical. So these are the 2 challenges that we have to do at the same time.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Teresa. I wonder if Dipti would like to chip in on some of these points that relates to a lot of what you talked about in the earlier part of the session. And we started a bit late, so we're moving a little bit past the half hour, although we're getting closer to the end, obviously. But Dipti, I'd like to hear your thoughts.
Sure. Sorry, my computer just powered down and I don't have my charger, but luckily Alex and I are here in the same space. So that's extremely helpful. It's such a fascinating conversation. And I think that people are raising really interesting issues. The question about GDP, I think Alex definitely alluded to the fact that what I was also thinking is that maybe we don't need to use GDP as a metric for how we're doing in society. What if we used human dignity instead? What if we used completely different metrics? And that goes back to what I was saying about the value system. Like, what are we using to judge ourselves and our human experience? And why are we continuing to use GDP when we know that the model of GDP is telling us that it wants unlimited economic growth? And we know very, very clearly that we live on a finite planet and that we just cannot have unlimited economic growth on a finite planet with finite resources. And we also know that we do not need to live that way. So I think that, these are some really interesting conversations happening here. And I wanted to offer that, going back to the question that was asked about, Sweden is not really thinking about climate change right now. And I think this is what I was saying earlier about solidarity. I think we just need to, agree with everything that Teresa just said about centering justice. And I think we also need to center solidarity so that, for people in Sweden to understand that their actions, like we are on this common home of ours together. The actions of people in Sweden are very directly related to, impacts faced in Mozambique or in India or in Colombia. And I think that that's part of the work that we need to do, is to talk about this human connectedness and to get people to understand, like to have that political motivation. As Teresa was saying, there are waves of, whether or not people are interested in climate. I think we just constantly need to bring it back to the fact that this is about justice. This is about people's lives. This is about survival or not. That's what's at stake for people and communities. And I think that's what we need to talk about in this conversation. And lastly, and of course, for a Swedish audience, I mean, someone like Greta has really showed us the way that we need the next generation of activists to pick up this issue, as has so beautifully happened in a place like Sweden, but needs to happen so much more in Sweden and in all of our countries. And for us to for us, as slightly older climate justice activists, to figure out how are we actually going to do this together? How are we going to bring more people into the movement of all ages, but especially the younger folks, to understand the struggles that Indigenous peoples, local communities are facing, to understand and contextualize 500 years of genocide, colonialism, and slavery that has led us to this point, and that the climate crisis isn't just something separate. It's actually very linked to these systems of inequality that, that for all of these generations that have brought us to this point. And to then take that analysis together and to really, build for the future. Like, we really need to bring more people into this movement and bring people along. And I think that's the work of political formation and education that we need to be doing together. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Dipti, for that. I think we're nearing the end. So any kind of last, 15-second... Oh, there is a question here from Tord. Okay, well, let's have that one then, and we'll go a little over time. But let's keep it quite succinct.
Well, thank you very much. It was really inspiring, especially the story about how the Sami people went to Harvard and claimed the necessity of total consensus. I think this kind of struggle, it's very necessary to bring forward not stories, but demands. And this is a demand. If I should be critical, I think there's a little too much about stories. It's certainly not time to only bring about stories. It's time to put specific demands on the table. And I think the climate movement has really to reconsider its total lack of understanding power struggles. It has not been at all interested in the military issues, not even COP26 coalition addressed the military issues. And suddenly, when this war, which is not certainly the first war, there have been much worse wars before the Ukraine war, suddenly they raised and immediately demanded, all the kind of actions related to Russian fossil fuel and Russian oil, which is, of course, not really the only problem. Now, Olaf Scholz is visiting South Africa, demanding land grabbing in South Africa, so they should continue their way of doing the green transition, including excluding Russian fossil fuel. Instead, they do land grabbing in South Africa. So with other words, I think that the answer to these issues maybe is the need for putting power struggle into the middle of it, including the kind of maybe micro struggle, which I think is utterly important from feminists or Samic people, but also attacking the militarized neoliberal world order, where actually Sweden is really one of the driving worst militarized forces on earth, destroying Afghanistan, destroying Libya, etc., etc. And of course, we have the Russian version of this military neoliberalism as well, which also has to be attacked. Thank you.
Thank you for that comment, really, Tord. So let's wrap this up and see if there is any sort of last, 15, 30-second points from the panelists as a way of concluding a discussion that, of course, just touched on many things. It can't be concluded in a short space of time, but I think we've really put a lot of stuff on the table. So who'd like to take a first go in a sort of concluding round?
Thank you. One reflection that builds off that question around kind of the logic of neoliberal capitalism, and also that question around apathy, is I think part of the neoliberal and Western way of knowing is that one thing is connected to one other thing, and it's linear. You do one thing and a linear reaction will happen, and that's not how the world works, and that's not how change works. So we're going to see the change happen in a non-linear impact. And so that unfortunately is true of the climate impacts that are locked in, but it's also true of our capacity to change the future trajectory of climate change. And so I encourage everybody to continue taking efforts where you are in your community in the way that you can. You may not see a direct result today, but the change will come in a way that maybe we can't exactly predict or expect. Can you add anything, Dipti?
I think that's really beautiful, and I do want to appreciate your comment, Tord, about militarism, and for sure that is something that is such an overt form of hatred and violence that is absolutely at the core of what we need to be stopping as a planet. I mean, we're talking about our starting point is even trying to build communities where people are living lives of dignity, etc. And I think it's absolutely a given from where I come from that we need to be stopping hate politics. The rise of the right that is happening in so many countries, from India to the US to Brazil to Hungary, so close to you. So I think that is absolutely something that we need to work on, and I think is very much a founding principle of climate justice, is that we need to stop that and then build the society that we really want to build with the value systems that we want to bring. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah.
All right, and I think it's very important to educate yourself and understand the links and parallel thing, like the fossil fuel industry works its way to continue, like with biofuel and land grabbing and whatever, and also, of course, to reach out and learn and get together and start beautiful transformation. Be strong, yes. Yeah.
And maybe my last point will to take us to something that I heard put very clearly throughout the session, which is reminding us that the real solutions not only center justice and are radical, but are the ones that go directly to the cause, address the cause of climate change rather than trying to address the symptoms. And I think these are the kind of principles and guiding stars that we just have, that will help keep us on track, and that we can't deviate from, because if we try to take a shortcut to the faster solution, we actually get lost on the wrong path.
Thank you. Åsa?
Yes, I would like to pick up on that, because I think what we need is to question and to have these critical discussions on the perspectives. Because as I see it, foundation of climate crisis is very much driven by the colonial worldview, and that is all over the world. And as I see it, also this extraction of natural resources and the notion that we should be bigger and better and gaining more, and that development and progress is based on the economical gain and economical growth. So in my perspective, we need to cut these colonial structures, and we need to look them in the eye and say that is not the future that we want. And that is also what I see with these real solutions towards the climate change. We need to have these critical discussions so that we can bring up what is the alternative for a true sustainable society. So that would be my concluding words. And thank you all to the panel.
Thank you so much, Åsa, for that. And I think that couldn't be a better way of wrapping up a conversation like this. I think there's not much more to say, but thanking you all for taking the time to join us, all the panelists and the audience here in ABF-huset, and people wherever they are in the world who are listening in. Thanks so much for this. it was tremendously stimulating and thought-provoking to be having this conversation with you all, and we look forward to continued conversations and action, as Cecilia just said. And again, welcome to come back here for the People's Forum, which is happening again very soon around Stockholm Plus 50, and there's much to check in on the web. Maybe there is a sign, www.Stockholm plus letters plus 50.se. There is much happening and a very, very interesting program of activities, and also many other things happening in the city around Stockholm 50, including several activities by the Fossil Fuel Treaty, which, again, as Alex said, is trying to really make maximum use of Stockholm to elevate this very, very interesting and inspiring momentum towards a real multilateral kind of process to dismantle the fossil fuel industry as a prerequisite for all these other things that we just have to get on with. So thank you, everyone, and we'll end here.
Thank you all. Ciao.
Bye, everyone.